The Labrador stood motionless in the corridor, shaking violently as his gaze fixed on the nursery entrance. When Sarah finally understood what had paralyzed her faithful companion with dread, her heart nearly stopped. For nearly a month, Max had been behaving strangely around baby Oliver, refusing to step into his room, hiding under furniture, his once cheerful demeanor replaced by something that resembled pure fear. Sarah's husband had begun using words like territorial and unpredictable. They'd even started discussing rehoming Max. One evening, Sarah heard a sound that made her blood freeze, a deep, continuous growl emerging from the shadows. She discovered Max in the hallway, every muscle taut, staring into Oliver's room with an intensity that seemed almost unhinged. What she uncovered in that moment was so devastating. It transformed their lives completely. The exhaustion. Sarah hadn't experienced proper rest in nearly 4 weeks. The fatigue etched itself into her features, creating dark circles beneath her eyes and making her movements slow and uncertain. She'd fumble with things, bottles, cloths, her phone, her hands trembling from the endless cycle of feeding, changing, comforting, repeating. The evenings had become a struggle where she battled against her own failing body, desperate to keep her newborn son safe and nourished. "I can't continue like this," she whispered one morning, her voice fracturing as she stood in the kitchen, staring blankly ahead. Her husband Daniel came up behind her, his own face marked with concern. "You need to rest," he said gently. But Sarah barely registered his words. She was observing Max through the doorway. The Labrador sat pressed against the distant wall, his eyes locked on the baby monitor, his entire frame tense. "Something's wrong with him," Sarah said, not for the first time. "He won't approach Oliver's room. He won't even look at the baby without shaking." Daniel's expression hardened. "Sarah, I think we need to consider." "Don't." Her voice emerged harsher than she'd intended. "Don't say it. He's displaying aggressive behavior, territorial instincts. What if he attacks when we're not present?" Sarah felt her throat constrict. Max had been her companion for 6 years. Her mother had given him to her shortly before passing away. The dog had supported her through mourning, through wedding preparations, through the anxious months of expecting. But now Daniel wanted her to believe Max posed a danger to their son. "He's not aggressive," she insisted. But her voice faltered, because the reality was, she didn't comprehend. Charlie's behavior, either the way he'd linger near the nursery entrance, but refuse to cross the threshold, the way he'd whimper when Oliver cried, retreating instead of investigating, the way his eyes held something that looked disturbingly like terror. "We have to prioritize Oliver," Daniel said quietly. "If something occurred and we ignored the warning signs." Sarah closed her eyes. The burden of new motherhood pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. She was so depleted, so exhausted, of worrying, of questioning every choice, of feeling like she was failing at everything. The breaking point. The crisis came on a Thursday evening. Sarah was in the nursery, positioning Oliver in his crib after a feeding. Max appeared in the entrance, his customary spot, but this time he didn't just observe. He growled low and sustained, his fur bristling. "Max, stop it," Sarah snapped, her patience finally shattering. She was functioning on 3 hours of sleep. Her body ached. Her son had been crying for hours with colic, and now her dog was behaving like some kind of feral creature. Max didn't budge. His eyes weren't on Sarah. They were locked on the crib, on something Sarah couldn't perceive. "Leave." She moved toward him, her hands trembling with frustration and anger. "I mean it, Max. Get out of here." The dog backed away, but slowly, reluctantly, his gaze never departing from the nursery. That evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with Daniel, tears flowing down her face. "All right," she whispered. "Contact your brother. Ask if he'll take him." Daniel reached across the table, squeezing her hand. Neither of them noticed that Max hadn't gone to his usual sleeping location by the fireplace. He was in the hallway again, lying flat on the floor, his nose aimed toward the nursery entrance, every muscle coiled with tension. The night, everything changed. Sarah couldn't sleep. Remorse gnawed at her conscience, mixing with the exhaustion until she felt physically sick. She'd made the decision Max would depart in the morning. She tried to convince herself it was the correct choice, the safe choice. But the thought of watching him go, of severing that final connection to her mother, made her want to weep. At 2:30 in the morning, she heard it. That sound that would echo in her nightmares for years to come. A deep, rumbling growl that raised every hair on her body. Sarah threw off the covers and rushed into the hallway. Max was there, positioned exactly as she'd seen him earlier. But now his body was shaking so violently she could hear his collar jingling. Max. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. The dog's head turned slightly toward her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her stomach plummet. Not aggression, not jealousy, pure, primal terror. Sarah's hand found the light switch. The soft illumination revealed the nursery Oliver sleeping peacefully in his crib, his chest rising and falling with each tiny breath. Everything looked normal, perfect, safe except for the blanket. The pale blue receiving blanket Sarah had tucked around Oliver's legs was moving, not from the baby's movements. Oliver was completely still, lost in sleep. The blanket was shifting on its own, a subtle undulating motion near the bottom of the crib. Time seemed to stop. Sarah's rational mind tried to supply explanations there from the heating vent of her imagination, exhaustion, playing tricks. But her body knew. Her body understood before her brain could process it, sending adrenaline flooding through her veins, making her legs move even as her mind screamed that this couldn't be real. She crossed the nursery in 2 strides. Her hands reached down and grasped the edge of the blanket. In one swift motion, she yanked it away. The discovery: the snake was small, barely 18 inches long, its brown and tan scales gleaming in the soft light. It had coiled itself near Oliver's feet, attracted to the warmth of the baby's body. A copperhead venomous triangular head turned toward Sarah's sudden movement, and for one horrifying second she saw its mouth open slightly, revealing those curved fangs. Sarah's scream tore through the house. She scooped Oliver into her arms so fast she nearly lost her balance, backing away from the crib as the snake slithered down to the floor. Daniel burst into the room, and the next minutes became a blur of panic. Daniel trapping the snake under a storage container. Sarah dialing emergency services with shaking fingers, both of them checking Oliver's tiny body for any sign of a bite, any mark. That would mean they were already too late. "I don't see anything," Daniel kept saying, his voice high with barely controlled panic. "Sarah, I don't see anything." The paramedics arrived within 12 minutes. They examined Oliver thoroughly under bright lights, checking every inch of his perfect skin. Sarah stood holding her son, unable to stop the tears streaming down her face, unable to stop imagining what could have happened, what almost happened. "He's fine," the paramedic finally said, and Sarah felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. "No bites, no signs of You got extremely lucky." A wildlife control specialist removed the snake, explaining how copperheads sometimes found their way into homes through small openings, drawn by warmth and the scent of rodents. "They're not typically aggressive," he said, carefully securing the snake in a container. "But when they're cornered or surprised, or when they feel threatened." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Understanding Max. Later, after everyone had departed, after Oliver had been checked and rechecked and finally settled back into sleep, Sarah found Max. He was still in the hallway, pressed against the wall, his body trembling. When she approached, he looked up at her with those same terrified eyes, and suddenly everything made sense. The way he'd started acting strange the day they brought Oliver home, because that's when the snake must have entered. The way he'd refused to enter the nursery because he could smell the danger, afraid to confront it alone. The way he'd positioned himself as close as possible to the doorway, standing guard, despite his fear. The way he'd growled, trying to warn her in the only way he knew how. He hadn't been jealous. He hadn't been aggressive. He'd been terrified and protective all at once, trapped between his instinct to guard his family and his natural fear of a predator he couldn't defeat. "Oh, Max," Sarah whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. The dog whimpered, pressing his head against her chest, and she felt his whole body shaking. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." She held him there, in the hallway, sobbing into his golden fur, thinking about how close they'd come to sending him away, how close they'd come to disaster. The paramedic's words echoed in her mind. "You got extremely lucky." Not lucky, protected. Daniel came to sit beside them, his hand resting on Max's head. "He knew," he said quietly. "The entire time, he knew." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. She thought about all those nights. Max had refused to leave his post in the hallway. All those hours he'd stood guard, watching, waiting, trying to warn them in the only way he could. And they'd called him jealous, dangerous. They'd planned to give him away. "I almost sent you away," Sarah whispered to Max, her voice breaking. Sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't understand." The aftermath. The next morning, Sarah sat in the nursery with Oliver in her arms, and Max pressed against her side. She'd spent the night checking every corner, every crack, every possible entrance. The wildlife specialist had sealed the opening. The snake likely used a small gap near the foundation. But Sarah knew it would be weeks before she felt safe again. Max's head rested on her lap, his eyes finally closed in exhausted sleep. His vigil was over. He'd kept his family safe, and now he could rest. "You're never leaving," Sarah told him softly, stroking his ears. "Never. Do you understand me? Your family. You've always been family." Daniel stood in the doorway, watching them. "Your mother knew what she was doing," he said quietly. "Giving you Max." Sarah looked down at the dog, at his peaceful sleeping face, and felt fresh tears slip down her cheeks. For Mother had always said Max was special, that he'd watch over her when she couldn't anymore. She'd thought she meant emotional support, companionship. She'd never imagined she meant this literally, that Max would one day stand between her son and death, holding his ground despite his fear. That day, Sarah called Daniel's brother and told him they wouldn't need him to take Max after all. She called her friends, told them the story, heard their shocked silence on the other end of the line. She posted the wildlife specialist's contact information in the neighborhood group, warning other parents about checking their homes carefully. But mostly, she just stayed close to her family. All of the Monde tried to forgive herself for doubting the one who'd never doubted his purpose, the greater truth. Sometimes the line between life and loss is guarded not by what we expect, but by what we misunderstand. Sometimes the guardian angel, watching over our most precious treasure, wears fur and communicates in ways we fail to recognize until it's almost too late. True protection doesn't always look brave. Sometimes it looks like fear, the kind of fear that stands its ground anyway, that refuses to abandon its post even when every instinct screams to run. Max hadn't failed to be brave. He'd been brave in spite of his terror, and that made all the difference. If this story shook you and opened your eyes to the silent protectors in your own life, don't forget to like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us how much we miss when we stop paying attention. Share it with friends and family, because sometimes the ones we're ready to push away are the very ones keeping us safe. Please leave a like on this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to The Gentle Bond for more incredible true stories of love, loyalty, and the magic that happens when a pet becomes family.